English is global. It is not a possession of the UK and the USA. The reason why English is so widespread is due to their colonizing nature. Let's just say it straight up. And this word fluency, it's so vague and it's so repeated, and it's one of the most commonly stated goals of people that come to work with me. I want to be fluent, full stop. I started to learn to ask people what it means to them. What does fluency look like to you? And I started to hear different answers from different people. This is where I saw the gap, people being fluent but not being able to speak or not being able to be present.
What is your idea in terms of what fluency is?
The $1 million question.
Before we dive into this conversation, please give me just 20 seconds. I know you've got hundreds of podcasts you could listen to, but any point during Unlayered, you paused and thought, that was me, or I felt that too. I'd love to ask a quick, simple favor. Please help me with a follow or subscribe to my channel, because that one click will not only help me bring more conversations to you, but for others who might need it. And it means the world for this work to continue. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation. Sukhi, welcome to Unlayered. I'm really excited to have you, and thank you so much for accepting my invite.
I am very grateful for the invite. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. I mean, let's dive into it. I remember I came across your LinkedIn profile through a mutual friend who I interviewed, and I remember as soon as I saw the title and the work you do, the bio part, which mentioned Embodied English Coach. That struck a chord in me, and it got me very curious to understanding what does this mean, because as I know, embodiment approach and the connectedness of the mind and body is something that I'm really curious and interested to learn more in my own journey. So let's start our conversation in that note. Okay, um, what does an embodied English coach means?
Well, good question. I feel like these words can encapsulate quite a lot, you know. So, just as a little bit of a background to me, I've been an English teacher in the ESL world for over 15 years. And during that process, I learned so much about teaching the English language, how to teach it, you know, classroom management, things like that. All of the practical stuff that you need to learn, and some of the stuff about the language itself. And when the pandemic hit, quite a common story, you know, some people lost their jobs. And for me, that something similar happened. I worked at two different schools in Manchester, where I'm based in the UK. And it was during that time that I took the opportunity to go solo. And actually, there was always something, I always felt something a little bit off about these schools, you know. It felt as though they were, hope there's not too much shade, but big money making machines, you know. And I saw the students as people who were giving money to these big companies. I mean, you know, that's a very, very condensed, reduced version of the bigger picture, but that's the feeling I had. So I knew I wanted to go solo. I went solo. I started posting on Instagram for fun. You know, it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
And over the last 5 years, it's really kind of transitioned from teacher. I recognized that teacher didn't fulfill everything as a title, um, as to what I was doing with my clients, with my students. And I recognized a gap. I recognized that lots of the people I worked with had a very high level of English. They were in professional settings. They were absolutely smashing life, but then they would just get to speaking English, and all of a sudden their body would shut down. They would lose their vocabulary. They would start sweating. Their heart starts racing, and it was a common story that I was being fed. And what tended to happen, I can only speak from my own experience, is these people who were feeling anxious or nervous or overly stimulated, overly activated in communicative settings in English, they would then seek out more English as a kind of solution to these issues. And I was also, um, with a bit of a lack of knowledge and going along with that too, and used to just feed more vocabulary, and it would just keep feeding their insecurity. And so I was like, what's going on here? And this is what kind of led me to professionally applying the kind of techniques and presence based techniques and ways to overcome those nerves, particularly in high pressure situations. And I'm on that journey still. I'm still on that journey. I'm still learning. I don't know if we can ever be fully versed in the body and the breath. It's the body is a lifelong lesson. So I'm on that journey, and all I'm doing is kind of facilitating. All I'm doing is guiding people towards being able to overcome moments of panic, high stress in the moment. And it doesn't have to be a consistent thing, it's just particular moments in people's lives. And so this is what I mean by embodied communication coach. I not only focus on I not only focus on communication skills specifically tailored for second plus English speakers, I also encourage people to use the tools to calm their nervous system, to build a bigger self-compassionate voice, to being more mindful in communicative settings instead of focusing on language. Language is just a small part of the whole communication process, whatever language you're using, but there is a lot more pressure placed on second plus English speakers. That was a long answer. Did that make sense?
That makes sense for me, and I really find that really interesting, where you connect the mindfulness, the breath, and the body towards the communication. We will dive into that because I have a lot of questions to ask, and I'm sure people who are listening to will learn a fresh perspective about communication and specifically English. If I take a step back, Suki, I think you talked about language is just a tiny part of this whole communication piece. I did went to Google and I searched what is English fluency. Google's answer for fluency is the ability to speak English smoothly, clearly, and without excessive pause. So it naturally got me into asking this question from you because you're a coach. What does your definition of fluency means? Because I think we've been fed or conditioned into this idea of fluency in various different ways, and we conform to this idea, and that's where English as like a came in as a language of like skill, intelligence, and all these constructs have been formed. What is your idea in terms of what fluency is?
The $1 million question. Honestly, this word fluency, it's so vague and it's so repeated. And before I give my kind of roundup of what I think fluency is, it's one of the most commonly stated goals of people that come to work with me. I want to be fluent,
Yep.
full stop.
Hmm.
And prior to the knowledge that I have now, I didn't really question it. I was like, okay, cool, yeah, who doesn't? Great, let's do some English lessons. And I started to learn to ask people what it means to them. What does fluency look like to you? What does it look like? And I started to hear different answers from different people. So there is this mm, kind of vague, there's a kind of vagueness to this word fluency. And I think the reason why is exams will, like Cambridge exams for English or whatever IELTS, they will have a tick list,
Yep.
few
Yep.
pauses, not so many hesitations, being able to express yourself within a given time, few mistakes, although not completely. Pace doesn't have to be fast. It can just be steady. I don't have a particularly fast pace to my speech purposefully. And but when I talk about my clients who come to me, it tends to be a feeling. I don't feel fluent. I don't feel fluent. And it's so interesting because they, in my eyes, are fluent. And so this is where my work began with this word, to be honest, fluent. I want to be fluent. And then getting people to recognize their words and the way that they view themselves, the perspective they have of themselves. So some of my work as well is not only about the breath and the body or mindfulness practices. In fact, mindfulness also includes an awareness of thought. So the answer to your question, what is fluency? If you're talking about exams, it's exactly what you mentioned, a little bit of a tick list. For me, that feels like restricted, it feels constrained, it doesn't feel natural. Like humans aren't tick boxes. Speeches and communication aren't tick boxes. It's messy and it's of the moment, and communication is living and breathing, and you have to adapt to every person. Like it's vast. So interestingly, when people complete, for example, a C2 level exam, it's incredible. What an incredible feat. I applaud anybody who does that. It's a marathon of an exam, even the C1. But then they leave. They've met all the fluency criteria. They leave. They go into the real world. They go to professional settings, and they lose their fluency. But they don't actually. You don't lose language. Language is, well, you can lose language over time. If you don't use it, you lose it, as people say. But this is the kind of gap. This is where I saw the gap. People being fluent but not being able to speak or not being able to be present. And that's where I kind of am developing. I'm trying to develop, or I'm trying to bridge the gap between fluency, body work.
Fascinating. In a way, do you think fluency is a subjective experience? Now, the reason for me to say that is like I completely agree. It took me back to my childhood, coming from a South Asian country, speaking non-English, like a different language, and having to go through IELTS. My parents put me into English elementary. We have the British, still the English, like the school system still. So that exposure, and then it was taught to us that it's all about communicating clearly without pauses. Just have to, like, the pace has to be really um, fluent or just steady. And it created a construct also, like a bit of pressure, especially even though I know the vocabulary, grammar. I was scoring really well in English stats ever since I was in primary school. But then still, when you get into high pressure environments, like interviews or IELTS exams where you have to talk in front of an examiner. Sometimes you feel everything that I learned, that check boxes, the tick boxes, the sentences, verbs, all tend to go into the dark. And this is where I can relate to, I still can relate to it. Hosting a podcast, coaching people, I still have that. But I feel over the time I built a bit of awareness around why it happens, around my thought. So my question is, do you think this fluency is like a subjective experience to each person based on their conditioning, based on what they have been taught, they are bringing the culture?
I feel like people get restricted by the markers that fluency are defined or is defined by. And within the English learning world or language learning world, you meet these markers and you get your exam result, and that's that. But once you leave this word, you know sometimes words can constrict you. These labels can
Hmm.
constrict you. You can be fluent, you can have all the language, mm, you can possess brilliant knowledge of the structures of a language, but then actually going into the real world and using it is a completely different experience to sitting in an exam. I sometimes, honestly, it might be a bit controversial, but I sometimes wonder who makes these exams for well, I mean, you can look who makes the exams, the governing body, but how does it really set people up for the real world of communication? These exams feel so out of touch with what true communication is. And that goes beyond English. That even goes to my own education in high school, for example. We're not taught these skills. We're not taught how to listen actively. We're not taught about how to ask better questions. We're not taught about interruptions or things that can set us up for the real world. And I'm just talking about communication. There's a whole heap of other stuff we're not taught in order to live in the real world. So I hope that answers your question. But one thing I wanted to say, if there are any English learners or people who use English as a second plus language and do feel these kinds of restrictions placed on them, or do feel when they go into a communicative setting they don't feel that great about themselves, maybe just to drop the labels and remember that communication is a human, messy thing.
Human and messy. Love it. Communication is human and messy. Couldn't have said that better. And thank you for sharing that openly. And it's eye-opening for me to hear it from someone like you. I wanted to ask from your experience coaching people. Um, let's say a non-native English speaker. I'm sure you help a lot of them who comes to you with a problem that is, okay, I want to be fluent, I want to speak English confidently, but what are the underlying layers? It could be the belief systems, the conditioning, or inherited fears that usually you get to observe now that you've coached a lot of people who are in that similar space. And how do you help them unlearn? Because I feel coaching is more about guiding people to unlearn than learning. I'm curious to hear your experience.
Pan, would you mind repeating the question?
Just about understanding, like from people who you've coached, especially
Hmm.
non-native English speakers. I know that when they come to you with a problem to improve their communication in English, confidently speaking, with less pauses, how do you approach the layers beneath that forms their limiting beliefs or the confidence, such as the inherited fears or conditioning that forms that belief in communication?
That is a great question, and I each person is different. Every person has their own internal world, and everybody has their own upbringing, their own past. And what's really interesting, and what you brought to mind was what I've noticed, particularly after going deep in the past couple of years in my clients, is that we all carry stuff from our childhoods, and we don't come to new people completely healed, if that's the right word to use. And so what I have noticed is that people who have issues with communicating in English, and they have these persistent recurring issues coming up while they go to communicate in English, it's so fascinating for me to see that a lot of their issues actually stem from something in the past. Now, I'm not a therapist, I'm not trained in any of that. I don't want to, I don't mm, propose going deep into someone's traumatic history, but recognizing that sometimes what people bring to their communication has nothing to do with language, actually. So for me, it's about identifying through really tailored questioning, which coaching is something that I've learned and I am learning, through through my courses and through just repetition of practice, recognizing within what someone's telling me, what my clients are telling me, what isn't being said, and then asking questions for that to be unearthed. I also recognize I've had a couple of clients whereby their I've had a couple of clients whereby their history has impacted on their communicative status, so much so that it went beyond my professional capabilities. Like I said, I'm not a trained therapist, so actually there are occasions where I might suggest, have you thought about, depending on, it's very, very delicate situation, but
Mhm.
depending on the context, the situation, just allowing people to kind of play around with the idea that maybe it's deeper than surface level stuff that can be overcome or worked through with mindset stuff. Mindset is one, our thoughts is one layer, is one level, and becoming aware. What tends to happen in my sessions is that there's an awareness of thought processes. That's the level that I'm at. Thought processes, how those thoughts can be disempowering, how to perhaps reframe, and using techniques to reframe those thoughts. This is where my coaching lies, as well as the body embodiment aspect, the breathing and the grounding. But then there's a deeper layer, people carry so much. We carry so much in our subconscious, and I'm so fascinated by it all. And it's due to my own story and due to trying to learn and unlearn about myself that I've started recognizing these patterns in other people. And when it gets to that deeper layer, when it gets deeper and deeper, that's when that's when um, that's when I can recognize that actually the way that someone is showing up in their day to day has nothing to do with English language. It's so interesting to see how past experiences can manifest and show as a fear of English. For other people, it will be different things, it'll be
Mhm.
going out in a social group, maybe, I don't know, getting on stage, or hosting a podcast. People might be really, really scared at first, and this for a lot of my clients, it comes up and it shows up when using English, and I'm not surprised because the pressure is immense to kind of communicate perfectly in English. It's the lingua franca, so there's a lot more pressure than other languages, you know. So unfortunately for people who are learning English, they have this immense pressure to be perfect.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Like, I'm glad that you used the layers part because you are in unlayered. I I wanted to get into that a different layer, maybe an in deep layer from our conversation about fluency, the checklists, towards the body, because you talked about a lot of the body's role in communication. And I think somewhere I saw you mentioned that communication begins in the body. I love that. Um, what does happen when, since you talked about feeling pressure in a situation, even if you feel like you're a fluent English speaker, sometimes even for a native English speaker in a high pressure meeting or a setting where the stakes are high, you might feel stuck or you might feel bodily sensations that doesn't allow you to be your true self. What happens to the body when you feel pressure in terms of communication?
Good question. And this is exactly what I am exploring a lot of now. I feel like I am in a huge learning period of my life when it comes to the body and the mind body connection. If I talk a little bit about myself, it's something that I realized I had to work through. I'm talking about speaking in English, in social settings, in professional settings. There was always this underlying kind of weird buzzing going on in my body anytime I would, not anytime, but a lot of the times I would be in social settings, even with my best friends.
Mhm,
And in professional settings too, I would hold myself back from speaking up, from asking for what I wanted and needed. And with my friends, I would be overthinking, or not only friends but social circles, just overthinking. People couldn't see. I was a I forgot the word, but so people couldn't see the anxiety in me in social situations. I could hide it well.
mhm,
I was a performing person with anxiety, so it was always under the skin, and I hid it very well. But it would completely take over my mind. It would hold me back from just being my authentic self. You know, I've had to really learn to understand what's going on in my body, and I didn't make the connection, to be honest, for a long time that my anxiety, the anxiety that I had in my body, was actually affecting the way that I showed up in lots of parts of my life. I lived a lot in fear, to be honest, and this fear just held me back. There were occasions where I would break through this fear and have the courage. I know I'm being quite vague, but there are specific moments in my life where I had to break through the fear barrier, do what I need to do, and grow from those experiences. And this is what, although English is my first language, and I know that there are different parts of the brain activated when speaking a second plus language. But the outcome, the fear, and the way that it makes you show up was similar. I could empathize with my clients. And so due to my own experiences, I started learning more. And when we feel pressure or nervousness, the nervous system shifts into protection mode, you know.
mhm.
And what English learners tend to do is say, "Oh, I can't remember the word, so it must be my vocabulary. It must be. I've forgotten the word, so I need to learn more vocabulary. That's what it is. I need to practice more." These vague goals, you know. And actually, perhaps it's depending person to person, perhaps it's about creating a sense of safety in the body in order to be able to approach these communicative settings in a more grounded way.
Hmm.
So when the body detects threats, I'm learning all of this now. I'm actually doing an accredited breathwork training course, and I am loving it. There is so much theory in there, and so much learning beyond giving the practical breathwork sessions. It's incredible. But some of the things I'm learning are, and it's not stuff that isn't known, isn't out there, but when the body detects threat, it activates your sympathetic nervous system, your fight, flight, freeze, and the brain moves blood away from the creative and language centers and actually just wants to help you survive. The brain's primary job is to help us survive, right? It's to
Hmm.
detect threats. So when that happens, if you're really nervous in a high pressure situation, if you're really nervous in a high pressure situation, the nervous system is um, the nervous system goes into protection mode. And this is why people say, my mind goes blank, my voice gets shaky, I can't find the words, I go sweaty, I don't speak up, I hold myself back, and it's nothing to do with the language. It for these specific people and these specific instances, and that's what I learned over the last few years. And I'm just bridging that gap between fluency, communication skills, and the mind-body connection. So this is the kind of package that I'm offering, so that people can go into the real world not only with language. Language is, like I said, a small part earlier in the podcast, but also with some skills for overcoming miscommunication, for asking better questions, for pausing, for things like networking, connection, language for connection, things like that. So it's a bit more of a connected communicative experience as well as the mind body experience. How can I ground myself in moments that I feel really nervous? How can I trust myself to deliver the message? What kind words can I give myself rather than beating myself up about making a mistake? So I hope that answers your question.
100%. 100%. And I think it's fascinating for me to hear those insights. And I'm also in that journey of understanding and learning the mind body connection, especially this polyvagal theory on how our sympathetic nervous system works. And it's amazing to hear, and you can relate to it in most of our reactions, like not just language, but to situations and how we are evolved to just survive. And when you have awareness around that system, then you can see the world in a different way and have more responsiveness to situations, including language. It since you were mentioning that, Suki, like I was just having a conversation with a client today, so I think it's a good moment to ask you this question. So he had these challenges in communication, like people have given him feedback that he rambles in interviews. He's looking for a job, but we've done some work to including some grounding work, being more present, touching the fingers while he's speaking so that you take your awareness into the moment rather than just talking out of fear, and then touching your feet, maybe the toe, sensing the sensation of the toe. So he's doing all that. But like one of the recent interviews, he's the traditional checklist of vocabulary. He speaks really well, scores highly in all English tests, can have a conversation with anyone. But he's got an interview recently where he faced an unexpected situation where he was expecting it to go as a normal behavioral type of interview where people ask about, tell me about a time that you managed a difficult stakeholder, where he was prepared, right? But all of a sudden, the interview was like a situation where they did a use case. I don't want to get into the technicals, but where it's like a more futuristic form of answering, okay, if this happens in this company, what would you do? Here is a use case. And then he got stuck after all the work. and is done in terms of preparing answers, researching the company, doing the breath work too, and then being present, like in terms of answering the questions. He got stuck because he faced this situation which he didn't expect. I'm sure this will happen to many other people, probably people who are listening to this conversation. You can do all the prep work leading up to an interview or a high stakes meeting, but how do you integrate your coaching here whenever you feel that you face a situation that is not expected? Is there a bodily practice that you can do?
I feel for your client being asked a question that you don't prepare for or you haven't prepared for is can be a scary situation, particularly if you're already working through feeling nervous and anxious in interviews and things like that. I think what's coming up is this sense of self trust.
Hmm.
This is a big word, and it's not something that happens overnight. And you can have these, you can do everything right,
Yeah.
you can do your breath work, you can do your grounding, you can get a C2 level, you can, have researched the company and still in the moment go blank. you know it's in those moments you can try to refer back to the tools of grounding, of telling your body that you're safe, or telling your body that it's safe, and coming back to the self. But it's tricky in live interview sessions because you're there, it's happening in real time. So, if you wanted a quick regrounding, it's as you mentioned, I would go to the feet. And so feeling the surface of your feet on the ground, feeling grounded, feeling supported by the ground that you're on, the ground that your feet are on, maybe also bringing your attention to where your body meets the surface of the chair. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be there for minutes, but you are reminding your body that you are grounded. If needed, take a breath. Our body senses safety not on the inhale but on the exhale. And why one tool that I try out with my clients is box breathing. Again, it's nothing you can't find out there or already out there, but my clients just won't remember to use it. So through repetition, they can take this tool away with them. And box breathing can be like an inhale of 4 seconds, holding the breath for 4, and a release for 8. There's different lengths. It's actually on the exhale that your body relaxes more. And that's what I would advise, even asking or saying, I'm just going to take a breath. You just reminded me, I I perform poetry, spoken word on stage, and I haven't
Mhm.
done it for a while, and it's still one of these things that creates anxiety in my body. Although now I feel like I've developed enough self-trust and confidence. Although confidence is wavering, it's not necessarily confidence, it's self-trust, and it's a development of my body posture and a recognition of my body and my awareness in a space. I'm a very aware person. And I was performing, or when I perform poetry on stage, spoken word, spoken word is brilliant. It's like this rhythmic kind of rap like rhyming of words, and it's all very personal and vulnerable. It's storytelling but with rhyme, and I think it's beautiful, and it can be funny, and it's a brilliant way to mess around with language. And when I get on stage, it happens to me. I
Mhm.
I actually force myself to do this. I haven't done it since August 2024, and actually today is the 18th of November. The the 21st of November, I'm doing it again, and I'm really scared, but I'm going to get on stage and I'm going to read my new spoken word pieces, and I'm excited for it. But last time I did it, it didn't matter how many breaths I did beforehand. It didn't matter about the exhales. As soon as I got on stage, my breath shallowed, my heart raced, my voice started shaking. I'm a communication coach, yet that can still happen to me. And I think one of the reasons why is because it's an unusual and unfamiliar setting. Your body also needs to get used to this repeated exposure to what scares you. So, yeah, a lot of the work when it comes to communicating is not just mindset, it's not just perspective, it's not just having the tools and the theory, it's actually going into the setting and repeating that process again and again to create this capacity for calm when you are in an unusual or unfamiliar situation. So if you're going for an interview and you go blank, it might happen. You might be able to reground. You might be able to even ask in that moment for a breath. The interviewers, depending on the job and what they're like, they might think it's great that you're able to um, recalibrate, that you can give yourself a moment in high stress moments. What a great way to show that you can do that. So yeah, it's very tricky to give um, it's very tricky to give like a blanket answer, because when it comes to humans, it's so subjective. Do you know what I mean? Every little aspect is subjective, and that's the thing about communication. It's vast. When I talk about being a communication coach, yeah, professional settings, it's different from when I'm talking about communicating with loved ones, where there's a lot of emotion involved. Each single uh, every person is individual, and it's crazy, and you have to adapt yourself to every person. It doesn't matter how many skills I've got in communication, it can still break down. Do you know what I mean? What do you think about that?
It's wonderful. I think I 100% agree. It's you cannot put it into an answer and then say this is the exact way of having this clear, perfect communication. I always question the idea of what perfect is. And I always think, I firmly believe that's subjective to each person. And it's an image. I think from my own reflections, I know these words, as you mentioned, labels, perfect, fluent, all that are constructs that we create based on society, what we've inherited from parents or the country that we're born in. But again, we create this gap between that construct and what we are right now, and that's that's probably we call fear. So for your answer, to recap it, I think it has a really beautiful lesson in there. It's sometimes it's allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to take a breath. Sometimes if we don't let ourselves take that one breath, and it can be simple as a simple breath in a high pressure situation, interview, or a meeting, and it can show that you are recalibrating. Okay, it's just the strength that you take a simple breath and getting yourselves back into communicating clearly and being more present with whoever you are with. And then the other part is the environment setting. No matter what you do, what practice you do, if your environment changes naturally for humans, it's normal for you to feel a bit stressed, feel a bit little anxious in delivering, especially when it comes to language. So being compassionate towards yourself. And as a coach, for me, it happens to me. It's easier as coaches for us to share, hey, do that and do this, being compassionate. But I sometimes catch myself not being compassionate towards myself when I do a little bit of a mistake. Oh, you did that. Why did you do that? And very self-judgmental about that appearing to be perfect because I have this title, the coach. So I think it's an invitation for all of us that just being compassionate towards yourself, that it's okay to make a mistake, but also repetition is key for you to be familiar with an environment. And for someone who's going through an interview, you have to repeat going to interviews and test yourself out there. The first interview won't be the interview that you will communicate and having that perfect interview delivered. So that's why I think the lesson of what you just shared can help or empower someone else who's listening. It's okay.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. How about you? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
um, maybe, hmm, perhaps my own audience will listen to this. I'll share it in my newsletter and things like that. And you have a story that many of my clients or mm, email readers might relate to, second plus language, learning it, exam process. And now, look, you are hosting your own podcast, and perhaps you've got, I don't know, a growth story with your English and your English communication. So, how did you get to, for example, no, how did you get to where you are now when it comes to being able to host your own podcast and, showing up for yourself and doing it all in English? You're in Australia now as well, right? So it could be a very inspiring story for my email. Sorry, it could be a very inspiring story.
Thanks for asking that, Suki. It's a long story. I'll try to keep it short, but I grew up in Sri Lanka in a middle class family. Both my parents were doing day jobs, and I grew up in like in an environment. Luckily, the education system was such that we had this system. Still, they have the British education system, so we learn English from grade one when you're just from starting the school. So we went to tuition classes. There's tuition classes too. So I was doing okay, but still, it was a very tough environment. I think the key moment of my story is in the school. I was a shy kid. Like I didn't speak up much, even in even in the household environment that I lived, the neighborhood. Like I lived with some of my other cousins. I was the eldest one, but still like I was attached to this or shared by relatives and friends that I'm reserved. I don't speak that much. So I felt like I carried that idea, and then it created an imprint. Now that I think about it, it itself is a little tree trauma. That's what I learned from my other guest. Even in school, so one of my friends told me, "Hey, you don't speak that much. I've never heard you speaking." I was always observing, listening, but for me, it was never about English or the vocabulary. I was scoring 98, 99 marks out of 100, not out of 1,000. uh, but still, even though I was scoring well when it comes to social situations, I carried that voice, that inner voice, and I felt like that was a wound, but I was not conscious at that age. So I picked IT as a study like after school because it was safe for me. So I don't have to speak much. I didn't volunteer for anything in like presentations in school, but I got forced into leading a group at the university and do some presentations. So that's where I felt like, okay, it was not as bad, and we got great marks. I was the one who was presenting our group project. That was a little bit of a aha moment for me. Okay, I've carried this for 10 years or maybe more, 20 years at that time, and people were commenting on how I spoke at that moment. my team believed in me, and that's where I start to like question what I've learned. And that was the starting of, I would say, awakening in a way, like for me to just start exploring and going deep to questioning my beliefs. So after IT, I had like a lot of challenges in the family, so I had to make a decision to migrate to Australia. Still, I was in IT, and during COVID, I decided to quit my IT job and then start something in coaching, just to uh, because I believe that I've always aspired to do something that is bigger than life and to give back to people like migrants or whoever those people who are carrying that silent kid label, to unlayer that. And a few years later, I've been able to help more than 200 people landing jobs through career coaching. And then now I'm having this podcast in a way to again help people unlayer the conditioning, and then explore life and explore their true potential. So it's a little bit of my story, Suki. I hope that I answered your question. But yeah, that's what I've been. My story has been so far.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's always good to get to know the person a little bit more, the person behind the podcast. Who is he? What's he doing? What's his story? I'm curious about that story as well. I'm curious about people who leave their home countries to start or to restart or to take advantage of opportunities, different opportunities and a different life. And it must have been really difficult, right, to leave. Or what kind of feeling did you have about leaving, and how has the integration process been, for example, with English as well?
That's a lot. Sorry, did you have a question on that?
Yeah, I'll ask the last question again because I didn't want to say English. I wanted to say communication. But so I wanted to say the question is, I am inspired by people who leave country and start again to take advantage of new opportunities. So how has that process been for you, and how has the integration process been when it comes to communicating?
It was definitely very challenging. It was like, even though I always talk to other migrants and I try to educate them, no matter what information you consume about migration and what integration will be, you will always find, you'll be surprised after you migrate. So for me, it was really again difficult going through rejections and what I've learned uh, as what it is in migration and culture. It was like a bit of a checklist, right? I go into Google and search about what Australia is, but when you actually start living with no support, and especially when the accent part comes in, and habits, culture, lifestyle, all that, it completely makes the whole experience so opposite to what you've experienced. So I'm not sharing this to demotivate or not encourage anyone to do this. I'm here doing a podcast because I chose to migrate. So there is a big positive side to it for me to move past the fears that I had, especially around what I am as a non-native English speaker, and then what native English speakers are. I was reflecting on that today because I always had that through television, watching TV shows. When I was a kid in Sri Lanka, thought, okay, this is this is superiority, right? But someone who's living in Sri Lanka still, who doesn't get that exposure, actually living in a country, would still operate in that method. But for now, I'm grateful that I chose that. So integration was really tough. So I can talk about accent, how I felt like that I don't belong. I felt like some person outside. Even in interview rooms, I knew I can do the job. Even after getting the job, it doesn't stop. It didn't stop. I felt it took me long to integrate and understand how the culture is, but I've made a conscious effort to adapt, but also to understand what my values and how my values are aligning with this new culture without just dropping everything. So it's really a different, like a gray area. Like that's why they say the third culture kid, right? Feel like you're not anywhere, and that integration is such a difficult experience. But again, it's one of the most rewarding experience for me in my personal experience, for me to now build a life and understand, especially the inner journey that I've been through is because of this migration experience. It's okay. I'm curious to ask you, your like I know that you were born and raised in UK, but did you have a similar exposure to like with your upbringing? Because I'm sure your parents, um, I don't know whether they are first generation or second generation. Did you have a similar upbringing in terms of living in a country like UK?
Mm. Firstly, thanks for sharing your story. I find it fascinating, but not only fascinating, inspiring, because I think so much of a person who has migrated to another country, so much of their story is hidden. There's so many little battles every day that people who migrate have to go through just to integrate, find a job, belonging, leaving the family, new culture, third culture. Oh, just so many things that the body and the brain are trying to process. So it's inspiring to me. And you mentioned, I know you asked me a question, but you mentioned accent, and that's really something which is prevalent in my mind and body today. I've got an Instagram post coming out about it. I saw a little BBC London news clip, and it was a lady who was from Southeast Asia,
Mm-hmm.
from the Philippines, I believe, and she's a nurse in a UK hospital. And she was talking about how, due to her accent, people would respond to her in a particular way, perhaps not in a pleasant way, or they would mm, make her feel like she's not being understood or that she's not speaking clearly. And it set off this whole chain of thought about how a lot of my work I do is about empowering your voice and coming to a place of acceptance when it comes to your accent, and actually working on intelligibility rather than focusing on reducing any kind of accent. And, it's all good and well me saying that and working with my clients, trying to overcome and work through these kinds of disempowering perspectives people have of themselves. But we've also got to, what I've been thinking about is challenging the systems that make those pressures real. The
Mm.
pressure to sound more British is real. Just because I say you don't have to sound more British doesn't take away the systemic pressure. And one of the mm, like you mentioned the word judging, you felt judged due to your accent, and my brain just focused in on that because that's exactly what some of my clients say. They will say that, if they do have an accent and they're working in the UK, they might be looked at or looked down on or looked at as inferior, and they experience this subtle judgment. It's not outright, it's not pointing a finger, it's a microaggression, perhaps finishing off someone's sentence or perhaps correcting someone's pronunciation. These are microaggressions. And perhaps also not allowing someone within an office space to have their voice heard. People who speak English as a second plus language living and working in the UK, I can only speak on account of people living and working in the UK from my own experience, get it tough. From what my clients have said, they have to work that extra little bit harder to be understood, to be heard. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention. I can, as a communication coach, I do touch on accent sometimes, but not reducing an accent, but a change of perspective or mindset, and really walking into a room holding your accent with pride. I can get somebody in theory to that place, but then in the real world, if
Mhm.
you're facing um, judgment, real judgment, it's not as easy as just telling yourself, oh, it's okay, my accent is beautiful, my accent shows identity, my accent is a sign of my courage. Another aspect to this is the teaching world as well, the English teaching world. In my group community beyond English, last week or the week before, there's a lot of discussions going on about empowering communication, and one of the things that came up was, what is fluency? I was asking each of them to create their own definitions, and they created a definition by themselves. But also, one of the things I stated isn't fluency is having a native like accent. What one of them brought to the table, bearing in mind this was a very specific example from a non-native English teacher in Spain. They he they brought to the table that even if they have even if they had a C2 level, which they have a C2 level in English, the schools require from them a kind of Britishness to their accent, to their vocab usage. So, you know, this is what you just made me think about and bring to the surface when you mentioned accent. I totally get it, and yeah, it's vast. The topic of accent is vast, and it goes deeper than trying to empower people. It's actually a systemic issue.
Thank you for highlighting that. I think it's more than ever that it is needed to address that. It's not just like, I know migrants coming from me and a lot of people I have, you put a lot of pressure in learning, moving countries, starting from zero, and just having two languages to learn to speak. But also the other part, there is another responsibility. I think you talk about that's one of the posts that I really love. I think it makes sense for me to ask that, is that communication, there's a shared responsibility from native and non-native English speakers, especially when it comes to power dynamics in a conversation. I feel how we've been trained, English speakers have the power, right, in communication, but how they can use this power to create psychological safety. It's what that I feel it's we can have a discussion on. What do you think?
This is an interesting question. It's something that I'm starting to explore more recently. It kind of ties into what I've just said, in that there is responsibility placed in both on both sides. Okay, so the people I work with come to me, they tend to be second plus English speakers, and we work on their mindset, their embodied communication, feeling powerful enough and creating this sense of confidence, or having the tools to tap into confidence and calm, a greater capacity for calm. You do all of that, you do the work. And then, recently I've been realizing there's incredible pressure placed on the second plus English speaker to get the conversation right, to speak perfectly, to make sure that they are understood. And I've thought to myself, what about native speakers? Where is their role? Where is their responsibility? And I was getting a bit pissed off with it all. Just like, why is all of the pressure placed on the shoulders of the second plus English speaker when they're the ones that have already learnt the language to quite a high level enough to go and work and live in an English majority speaking country. So I feel like there is this responsibility, and I feel like it's something that probably needs addressing nowadays.
Mhm.
English is global. It is not a belonging, it is not a possession of the UK and the USA. The reason why English is so widespread is due to their colonizing nature. Let's just say it straight up. And now there is an expectation that people learning English, living and working in majority English speaking countries need to be perfect. But where is the responsibility of the native speaker? And I'm talking about, not just the everyday person in the street. I'm talking about professional settings. I'm talking about offices. I'm talking about people who have the power to train their staff in how to adapt their English to a global variety of English. I feel like native speakers need to get with the times. They need to
Mhm.
get with the times. They need to update their skills. Like people, business owners, start training your staff, start training in them in how to communicate globally. I know some companies do this. I've seen on LinkedIn there are a couple of people who work with big companies, Google, NASA, to reduce accent bias or to work on accent bias, and it's a thing. But I think it needs to be a wider thing. I think it needs to be introduced as training. And actually, it's something that a colleague and I are currently working on. And so it's interesting that you've mentioned that we're just I don't know whether I should say this. Cut that bit. Maybe I shouldn't allude to it just yet. Yeah, no, I won't.
That's all right.
But
Like, I I I think I really appreciate you sharing this open-heartedly. I can see the sense of passion like you share in this message of the role the native English speakers should play in making this fair and understanding. And I think there's a more part to play in listening with less judgment. That's why the accent, like the bias in accent and the role that they need to play around communication, whether it's an interview, workplaces, professional settings, or in a normal living, whether it's a cafe or a restaurant, whatever. It's sometimes it's the awareness that I think the leaders or people, whether it's the senior leaders in companies or politicians who have to invest on to create programs, training, so people are more conscious of their biases.
mm,
Otherwise, as you said, migrants will do all the hard work, but the systemic challenges will still exist, and it will be
mm,
still creating this gap of some particular crowd of like people doing the work, but there's this other part, and we will be still the same. So I think it's a very valid
mm,
lesson, and invitation for all, including native English speakers, for to rethink about how we perceive communication. So I think
mm.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Well, I mean, I can talk with you for long. I think we've touched on a lot. I wanted to jump
Yeah.
into accents the next time we talk, right? But I think we've covered so much today. I really appreciate your honesty, um, and your generosity in your wisdom. I think what you're trying to do is truly magical, beautiful, and it's needed in the world today. And I truly, truly believe it. So, thanks again for your time. We end our conversations with one last final question, that is, what's one thing you unlayered or unlearned?
Mm. One thing that I had great question. I had an array of thoughts go through my mind because I feel like in my life recently, long story short, a lot of unlearning has been happening. One thing that I think I've recently unlearned is that fast pace and productivity equals success. Actually, slowing down and becoming more present is, for me, success because the more present I am, the more I can tap into the gratitude of, sorry, the more present I am, the more I can tap into the depth of joy.
Wow. I have no words. It's beautiful. Thanks for your presence during our call. I felt I was alive in the conversation, and thank you for creating the space for it. Um, Thank you so much, Suki.
Thank
And
you so much for having me. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love talking about all of this stuff. And yeah, thank you.